You clean one corner of the kitchen counter and immediately notice the rest of the room still needs attention. You take one walk and realize you're still out of shape. You spend one afternoon organizing your finances and suddenly become aware of every other area of life that also feels unfinished. And for a lot of people, that's the exact moment they quietly stop. Not because they don't care, but because modern culture has trained people to expect progress to feel dramatic, visible, fast. So when growth unfolds slowly, the nervous system often interprets that slowness as failure. And what's interesting about that is many women in midlife are actually making far more progress than they realize. It just doesn't look the way they expected it to, because this stage of life often involves rebuilding internally before anything externally obvious changes. You may be becoming emotionally healthier while your life still looks relatively the same from the outside. You may be developing stronger boundaries while still learning how to tolerate the discomfort that comes with disappointing people. You may be slowly rebuilding your health while still carrying years of nervous system exhaustion. You may be becoming clearer about what you want while simultaneously grieving old versions of yourself that no longer fit. That kind of progress is real, but because it unfolds gradually, many people overlook it. And I think a lot of people underestimate how conditioned we've become to look for immediate evidence that change is working. We live in a culture built around visible transformation. Before and after photos, fast results, quick fixes, productivity metrics, overnight success stories. But most meaningful human change doesn't actually happen that way. The nervous system changes through repetition. Trust changes through repetition. Identity changes through repetition. And emotional resilience usually develops quietly long before confidence catches up. There's research in behavioral psychology showing that repetition matters more than intensity when it comes to long term habit formation. And when you really look at how the brain works, that makes sense. The brain is constantly scanning for patterns, not isolated moments. One intense day does not convince the nervous system that life has changed, but repeated experiences begin creating evidence, evidence that you follow through, that calmer rhythms are possible, and evidence that your life is becoming more supportive. And over time, those repeated experiences begin reshaping identity. I think this is one reason so many people feel discouraged when they attempt dramatic reinventions, because dramatic reinventions often rely on emotional intensity, and emotional intensity is difficult to sustain, especially during midlife when many people are already cognitively overloaded. You try to overhaul everything at once, wake up earlier, exercise daily, completely change your diet, declutter the house, start journaling, drink more water, meditate, fix your sleep, launch a new career path, become emotionally healed, and within a few weeks, the nervous system starts resisting. Not because you're lazy, but because the brain interprets massive, unsustainable change as instability. And honestly, I think many women have spent years feeling ashamed of the fact that they cannot maintain impossible levels of self reinvention indefinitely. But sustainable growth is usually much less dramatic than people expect. Sometimes it looks like consistently going to bed 30 minutes earlier. Sometimes it looks like walking several times a week instead of trying to completely transform your body in 30 days. Sometimes it looks like responding differently during one difficult conversation. Sometimes it looks like slowly reducing how much access emotionally draining people have to your energy. And over time, what starts happening is something incredibly important. The nervous system begins trusting repetition more than motivation. That matters because consistency creates predictability, and predictability creates emotional steadiness. There's one reason repeated small routines often feel strangely grounding during difficult seasons. Not because the routines themselves are magical, but because the nervous system relaxes when life becomes less chaotic and less dependent on constant emotional negotiation. I've noticed this even in very ordinary parts of my life. There are seasons where everything feels mentally scattered, and then one simple repeated behavior starts stabilizing more than expected. Maybe it's preparing coffee before bed. Maybe it's taking a morning walk without your phone. Or maybe it's resetting the kitchen every evening. It could be reading for 10 minutes before sleep instead of scrolling. The actual habit itself is often less important than the repeated signal it sends. The signal becomes, I am building a life that supports me. And what's interesting about small repeated actions is they also reduce overwhelm because they stop requiring enormous amounts of intentional activation. Many people think change requires feeling highly motivated, but behavioral science consistently shows that relying on motivation alone creates inconsistency because motivation fluctuates based on your energy, stress, sleep, emotional state, hormones, environment, and cognitive load. Which means if your entire growth process depends on feeling inspired first, progress becomes emotionally unstable. But small, consistent actions bypass some of that instability. You stop asking yourself to become an entirely different person overnight. You start becoming someone who simply repeats supportive behaviors more often. That's a much calmer way to grow. And honestly, I think many people in midlife are craving calmer ways to grow. Not more pressure or self criticism, not another impossible standard, just steadier movement. Because eventually there comes a point where people begin realizing that burnout disguised as ambition is still burnout, and the nervous system keeps score. Years of extreme pushing eventually creates consequences: mental fatigue, emotional numbness, difficulty resting, difficulty focusing, chronic overstimulation, feeling disconnected from yourself, living in cycles of intense effort followed by collapse. And when that becomes normal long enough, many people unconsciously stop trusting themselves. They stop believing they can follow through consistently because their past experiences have mostly involved unsustainable extremes. This is where small progress becomes emotionally important. Not because small progress looks impressive, but because it rebuilds self trust gradually. Every repeated action becomes evidence. You begin seeing yourself differently, not through dramatic declarations, but through accumulated lived proof. And I think that's one of the biggest misunderstandings people have about confidence. Most lasting confidence is not built through motivation, it's built through evidence. The nervous system starts believing what it repeatedly experiences. So if your life repeatedly shows, I quit, I burn out, I overwhelm myself, I stop, then eventually the brain anticipates inconsistency. But if your life slowly begins showing, I return, I continue, I follow through in smaller ways, I keep moving even during imperfect weeks, then identity begins changing. And over time, the emotional relationship you have with yourself changes too. You stop experiencing growth as punishment. You stop associating progress with exhaustion. You stop feeling like every goal requires suffering. And instead, life starts becoming more rhythmic, more sustainable, and supportive of the actual human nervous system you live inside. I also think there's something emotionally healing about realizing that slower progress is still progress because many women quietly carry shame around not moving faster, not healing faster, or accomplishing more, not becoming better quickly enough. But healing has pacing. Behavior change has pacing, and identity change has pacing. The nervous system often requires far more repetition than the mind expects, especially after years of chronic stress or emotional overextension. That's part of why sometimes people become discouraged when life still feels emotionally messy, even after they've started making healthier changes. But one healthy week rarely undoes years of survival adaptation. One boundary does not instantly remove people-pleasing conditioning. One restful weekend does not fully recalibrate a chronically overstimulated nervous system. Growth usually unfolds through accumulation, quiet repetition, small shifts that slowly become normal. And when you really look at meaningful life change, most of it is surprisingly unremarkable while it's happening. The change often looks ordinary day to day. You choose a calmer response, you pause before reacting, you take the walk, you go to bed earlier, you said no once, you returned to the habit after missing several days instead of abandoning it entirely. Those moments rarely feel cinematic, but they are often the exact moments identity is changing underneath the surface. And what's interesting about this stage of life specifically is many women are no longer interested in building lives that only look successful externally. They want lives that feel emotionally sustainable internally. That's different because emotional sustainability requires pacing. It requires nervous system awareness and understanding that consistency is usually more transformative than intensity. I think many people are beginning to realize they don't want another cycle of extreme motivation followed by exhaustion. They want steadier energy, more presence, more internal clarity, more trust in themselves. And that kind of life is usually built through smaller, repeated decisions, not dramatic declarations, not perfection or constant optimization, just repeated supportive choices that slowly reshape how life feels. So maybe instead of asking yourself, how do I completely change my life? A more supportive question might be, what small repeated action would make my life feel slightly more stable over the next month? Because sometimes the biggest transformations begin through behaviors that barely look important at first. A nightly reset, a short walk, 5 minutes of quiet, a healthier boundary, one repeated promise kept, and eventually those smaller moments begin becoming evidence that a different way of living is possible, not through force, but through repetition, through pacing, and through steadier rhythms that the nervous system can actually sustain. And maybe that's part of what real growth looks like in this season of life. Not becoming an entirely different person overnight, but slowly becoming someone who lives with a little more intention, a little more steadiness, and a little less internal chaos than before. If this episode resonated with you, make sure you subscribe to Clarity Reset. And if you want additional tools to help you build calmer, more sustainable rhythms in your life, I'll leave the Clarity Reset resources below. And until next time, remember that meaningful progress is often happening long before it becomes visible. Keep going gently. Your nervous system responds to repetition more than perfection.